Any questions about the discussion material from last time? I covered a lot of ground and some of it fairly rapidly. So any questions, thoughts, doubts? Not yet? Or let me see if I can make it possible if you have doubts by the end of today's lecture. We're going to start talking about Adam Smith, because in any discussion of classical economics, indeed any discussion of economics, if it's done properly, Smith has to be a starting point because of the tremendous contributions made. Let me start by the first point he makes in The Wealth of Nations, which is his claim that labor is a source of new wealth. Famous paragraph: the annual labor of every nation is the fund which originally supplies it with all the necessaries and conveniences of life, which it annually consumes, and which consists always either in the immediate produce of labor or what is purchased with that produce from other nations. So labor, annual labor of every nation is a fund which originally supplies it with all the necessaries and convenience of life. Now, Adam Smith is obviously aware of the existence of land and of machinery. It's going to be central to his discourse. So what can this mean then, to say that labor is this fund which originally supplies all the necessaries and conveniences of life, the annual labor of society? What can that mean? Well, yes.
Well, whatever is produced through labor, only then you can have something that's valued and be sold and exchanged in the market.
Okay, but he's not yet talking about it. He's saying wealth. So the question is, he hasn't come to that other part, which is the question of how labor has an effect on the value, meaning in his sense the exchangeable value of things. But he's here speaking of labor as the source of wealth.
You can infer that capital is also the final destination of labor of previous periods.
Okay, you could argue that capital, and the term capital is a term I want to try not to use. I prefer the term means of production, because capital gets confused with the idea that it means for profit. Means of production are obviously an older phrase. Societies which don't use buildings or tools to make profit have them also, but they're not necessarily capital. Okay? But let's say that he's aware that certainly means of production are produced by previous labor. But it's clearly, yes. In the back, yes.
I think it's like that wealth is ultimately command over labor. So basically, like if you have wealth, you have the power to put labor into movement.
Yes, I think that's closer to the right thing, which is that labor is the active element of the production process, right? Raw materials are there, tools are there, but what puts them into motion is human labor. And he's saying that in that sense, labor is the ultimate source. Not because it does it unaided, but because it does it. Because in the classical tradition, the production process is seen as a labor process. This will become very big in Ricardo and even bigger in Marx. But this is a clear distinction, I think, from the notion of a production process in orthodox economics. How would you represent in neoclassical economics the production process? What's a typical representation?
Capital, labor,
Yes, you write a function. Y is a function of K and L. K and L being capital and labor. Now that makes it seem as if both, in effect, create the output. And Smith's point is that the labor process uses tools, that K is tools, raw materials, machinery, used by the L, so the L is the active element. It's a different vision of the production process. And this is not because he believes that there's anything wrong with using tools or land, by the way. It's also obviously you can't produce agricultural goods. In fact, we can't do anything without the ground we stand on. That's also an element to the production process. But production itself is a labor process. And this is the starting point of a classical perspective on production. It's an active process. Smith will talk about the produce, and Ricardo also, of nature which comes unaided. Perhaps there are trees and you can just stand under them and fruit will fall into your mouth. But by and large, the production that society depends on requires the active creation of the product. And so there is that important connection. Any questions about this? Then right away Smith says, okay, but not all labor is productive. So not only is production a labor process, but only of part of labor is involved in the production process. And here he's speaking of a distinction between labor which creates new wealth and labor which uses it up in some other function. This is the famous distinction in Smith, which is reproduced in Ricardo and Marx, but in different ways, with different specifications, but a distinction between labor which produces wealth and labor which uses it not to produce wealth, but for some other function. Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that for a second?
Okay, so suppose that you consider a village that produces, the wealth that it needs, the corn, the raw materials, but the building, the kind of movie villages that you get. If people are more or less self-sufficient there and produce locally, that labor involved in all of that collective activity is production labor from the point of view of Smith. But now suppose you're being attacked by some predatory gang. This is actually I never think of these on my own. This is the story of the Magnificent Seven, which is, of course, a Japanese movie originally, transposed to an American version of it, in which in this movie there is a village whose wealth is being taken from it forcibly by a gang of thugs, a Mexican gang. This is all set in Mexico. The Mexican leader is Eli Wallach, because in those days they didn't have Mexicans to play Mexicans, they had Jews to play Mexicans, so nearest ethnic minority, so to speak. So Eli Wallach is the leader, and he wants the wealth from that village. But in order to protect its wealth, the village hires 7 cowboys of dubious distinction, because they're all failures in some way, but they are hired by the village to protect them from these thugs. Now, is the labor of the 7 cowboys protecting the village production labor or non-production labor? Well, Smith clearly says it's non-production labor. Can you see why it's non-production labor?
There's no wealth generated by them protecting them. It's just
Indeed.
keeping wealth.
Indeed. They are protecting the wealth. They're preventing its forcible transfer. So therefore, they're useful. He never says that non-production labor is labor that's bad. He calls it unproductive, but the proper translation in the sense of the meaning of it is non-production. And non-production labor, in the sense of Smith, is labor which is not involved in the creation of new wealth, but in other social functions. And those other social functions have a list of things, which I have somewhere in here.
So does that count as like all services?
Well, in Smith, there is an association with non-production labor and services because he mentions the state as non-production labor. He doesn't say that the state is unnecessary. He says it performs a different function. It uses up wealth to administer, to protect, to ensure the rules are followed and all of that. He lists the king as a non-productive laborer. And he goes on to say, I don't mean anything bad, Your Majesty, you know. This is just a scientific definition, the distinction between the producer and the non-producer. He therefore counts also the army. He also counts people who circulate titles, you know, what we would now call wholesale, retail, and finance, as non-production labor. Now, one could easily argue that these are necessary, though one could also argue they're not always necessary. But anyway, they may be necessary. It's not a pejorative term in Smith to say unproductive labor. It means labor not involved in production. Is that point clear? Now the question, of course, in Smith's time, that distinction falls very easily into services and non-services, into physical goods, and Smith himself falls into that trap of physical goods versus non-physical goods, because all the categories we listed here are easily seem like the services. He says a man who gets rich by employing laborers, but he gets poor by employing servants, because the servants are in the act of consumption. You can think of the state and the military and the king and all of that also as forms of social consumption. And so consuming wealth does not produce wealth. There's a natural distinction, and we always make that also. You make your food and you eat it. Yes, you have to eat it in order to be able to make food again, so it may be a necessary activity, but obviously they're distinct. The most classic modern example of it is you cannot go into any store without having a set of people watching you, following you around to make sure that you're not going to steal the material. Well, everybody understands, even the store owners understand, that their function is necessary, but it's coming, so to speak, out of the profits of the firm. It's preventing theft and therefore reduction in the in the inventory and sales of the firm. Any questions about this? Now this question will appear again in Ricardo and will appear in Marx. But in Marx the distinction will not be between physical goods and services. And of course, because as people develop these ideas, they get more refined. I would argue nonetheless that this is a very important distinction. Present in the world today, very important. Ask yourself, how many parts of the world have huge armies which they support? Are the armies necessary? Well, if you ask the army, definitely. If you ask some people, perhaps not, but the fact is that they are a form of social consumption. They must be paid for through the production of the wealth. The money is just a means of getting their access to that wealth. So that's... Now, I won't probably pursue this for some time, but just to complete the story about services, one could give a clear example in which services are all, in which all the activities are services, but some of them are production and the others are not. This actually comes from Marx, but imagine a concert. The people who put on the concert, that is the ground crew, the musicians, the people who do the lighting and all of that, stage, everything else, that's a production crew, including the main act, right? That makes sense. It's an ensemble whose activity is designed to present you with a concert, which, as Marx points out, is as real as anything else. It's literally so real you can capture it on film and on audio tape because it's a real effect which you consume. However, there's a set of people whose job it is to prevent you from getting into that concert for free. There are cashiers and guards of various sorts, and from the point of view of the producers of the conference, yeah, that's also true, of the concert, they are absolutely necessary because they prevent you from consuming it without paying them. And lastly, there are a set of people who have a more general function to keep the order, prevent people from beating each other up when they get a little too drunk and all of that. And that is a kind of policing activity of a different sort than the preventing you from coming into the concert. Now, in this case, the production labor, which produces a concert directly and indirectly, the distribution labor, which requires you to pay in order to get in, and the guard labor, which preserves the social relations around that, are all services. And yet, it's clear, at least to me, that this is a meaningful distinction. It's always difficult to draw the exact line. Some person may perform more than one activity, but these are meaningfully distinct activities. Okay? So Smith is actually introducing at this moment a very powerful thing, which is the idea that labor as the active subject is a source of new wealth, but even labor is distinguishable between that which produces the new wealth and that which uses it for other purposes. Okay? It's a very interesting exercise to go across countries and see how much of their wealth is used by labor involved in the state and defense and so on. The state, insofar as it's not producing. Obviously, the state can run a farm or run a factory, in which case it's production labor, but administrative activities are not. And of course, from that classical definition, neither is finance, real estate, wholesale retail, Wall Street, and so on. Yeah.
The bank and finance is productive or unproductive labor?
In the classical tradition, it's non-production labor. It's labor involved in the circulation of money or the circulation of titles, stocks, bonds, real estate titles, and so on. So it's non-production labor. It's a circulation labor.
Even though you have the speed of circulation of capital.
Yes, because that makes it necessary. Justifies its necessity, just in the same sense that the Magnificent Seven are there to prevent the wealth being taken by the thugs, right? They're necessary. But that doesn't mean that they are producing the wealth of which they're trying to protect. In fact, to support them, you have to give them a portion of that wealth. And so this is not an issue, as I tried to say at the beginning of the class, this is about the history of thought, but it's about ideas which, in my opinion, are very relevant and perhaps more relevant than the conventional notion now that anything which is supported by the market is productive. So that only the state can become unproductive insofar as you make a judgment that it would not be supported by the market. That's confusing profitable or marketable with the different notion of production of wealth. And that is, in my opinion, a superior notion. Question, yes?
Would reproductive labor constitute a source of value?
I didn't say value at all. We're talking only about wealth. I didn't use the word value. Okay. Smith doesn't use that word here. We're only wealth. We're just talking about wealth. Okay. And humans don't count as that. Humans are the active subject, so reproducing humans wouldn't count. However, reproduce cattle would, because that's part of the consumption or the wealth itself. Okay? So now, Smith comes to the second important classical point, which is that the division of labor within a society is one of the greatest sources of the increasing productivity of the labor and hence of increasing wealth. Right away, this has come out right in the beginning on the first page. Pardon? Yes. The division of labor within a society is, according to Smith, one of the greatest sources of increasing the productivity of labor and hence increasing the collective wealth of the society. Now this is the famous pin factory example, which is very well known, but just to remind you of it, Smith says, well, if you were to produce a pin yourself, then you'd have to do through each stages. What are the stages? You have to melt steel or melt iron into it. You have to draw it out, it's called, let it run into a channel where it cools. You have to wait for it to cool. Then you have to shape it. You have to put a point on one end. You have to cut it and put a top on the other end, and you've got a pin, and then you have to repeat that task. Well, Smith says, on the other hand, it's possible to assemble people in a process in which each step in that is done by a different set of people. That's a division of labor now, right? And he points out that then you can produce 10,000 times more pins in a day if you had a collectivity separating the tasks. Though that might not necessarily be good for the individual, because you may lose the ability to do all the knowledge, you may lose the pleasure of it, but you can also produce much more. So he says the division of labor in the history of society is one of the great mechanisms for increasing the wealth of society. Yes?
He hinted at specialization in that example when he was talking about someone who's skilled at the task versus someone who's not. Does he expand on that later?
Yes, he says that the contribution of labor to wealth depends also on the skills and modified of the labor force, and includes the individual productivities of people. But he's concerned here about the fact that the wealth of societies cannot depend on the accidental abilities of individuals, right? Insofar as a skill is teachable, is learnable, then it becomes part of this process of developing that skill. And that's what crafts are and all of that. In no instance are they concerned with any special abilities per se. These are socially transmittable abilities. That's a key point. And he actually has a very nice point, since you raised it. He says that the construction of these different activities, divisions of labor, give rise to apparent differences in talent, but they are actually differences which are, in a sense, schooled. They come from practice. And I have to cut back and forth between these two sets here. He says, the division of labor leads to apparent differences among people that seem to be imbued in them. But Smith is very progressive. It's quite astonishing. He says, this is a quote, "By nature, a philosopher is not in genius and disposition half so different from a street porter as a mastiff is from a greyhound." Now, what's the point of that? He's saying that this is a socially constructed difference among the humans, a philosopher, which is, by the way, what Smith is, a professor of philosophy. And he's saying that it's not so different from a street porter, which is the lowest level, as a mastiff is from a greyhound. Two dogs whose breeds make them different. Whereas these are, in the case of a philosopher and a street porter, socially constructed, learned differences. And this is an important point because, of course, one can find in the literature of every time the argument that those who are well off because they are inherently superior. And Smith is not saying that. He's not saying that it's not possible to be inherently superior, but the fact is that other factors also intervene. In that sense, it's quite modern. Then he raises the question of how does a division of labor arise in society? What brings it about? He's established that it creates social divisions that seem as if they come from nature, but they're not. He's established it increases the productivity of labor. But what's the root of it? And here Smith has a very specific answer that not necessarily accepted by others, certainly not by Marx, which is that the division of labor arises from what he calls the trucking disposition of people. And therefore he links the division of labor to exchange. In exchange, People, when people exchange, they can specialize. By specializing, they can produce more for exchange, and this gives a feedback loop, which leads, in his representation of things, to the division of labor. Yeah, that's not a very sound anthropological argument, and certainly it's rejected wholesale by Marx, who argues division of labor comes in society long before exchange plays any central role, or even in arenas where exchange has no role whatsoever. But this is important because the idea that comes from the trucking disposition of people, by means the tendency of people to exchange things, to do things for exchange, becomes fundamental to neoclassical economics, because it's going to bring that notion as being intrinsic to human consideration. It becomes a central notion in neoclassical economics, the idea of getting more and using exchange as a means of getting more. He also makes the further point that the extent to which you can therefore have a division of labor is limited by the market. Now this follows from his idea that exchange drives the division of labor. Well, then the division of labor cannot go beyond what exchange permits, which is the size of the market. But ask yourself this: can we imagine societies in which there's a wide-scale division of labor and not much exchange? Well, in which exchange doesn't play the central role in the reproduction of the society.
How would you visualize the exchange of labor? Is it the exchange of products?
He's speaking of the exchange of products here. Exchange of products. I should have said that. That's a good point. He's speaking here of the exchange of products, which he somehow views as arising from this natural tendency of people to truck and barter, as he calls it. And that leads to markets. And I was going to come to the point, he also argues that it's from this that money arises. Money arises from the extension of exchange. It's not a natural property. Gold is not money because it's gold. Gold becomes money when exchange needs commodities, and gold is only one of many commodities to become money. By the way, I'm doing what I typically do, digressing, but anyway, what are the different forms of money historically? What was the money in Virginia in the early days of the US Commonwealth? Tobacco, right? Tobacco. Earlier, other forms of money? Salt. Iron bars, metals, because they had properties that were, in my book, which I finished over the summer, I have pictures of some beautiful sources of money, beautiful forms of money. Flying fox teeth and jaws, which are quite lovely and hard to come by, and quite durable. There's a book called Primitive Monies by Alison Quiggin. It's very hard to find, but it's in the library. And I recommend it because it's an absolutely fascinating account of the rise of money, written by an anthropologist. So she's not trying to tie it in to self-interest and all of that. She's describing the source and origin of money. Very wonderful book to read, and great pictures. Books should have good pictures, yeah. I think it's called Primitive Money. But if that's not exactly right, remind me and I will... the author's name is Alison Quiggin, Quiggin. And one of the advantages is that she cuts across different cultures and histories. There's a strong tendency in the Western tradition to treat money as if it arose in Rome or Greece or something, which is obviously not true historically. Okay, but this is a digression. Okay, so that is this set of arguments around the division of labor, its importance in developing wealth. So we start with the labor as a source of wealth, the division of labor as a source of increasing the productivity of labor and therefore a crucial source of increasing wealth. And now he comes to the part which is the section on value. And the term value here is not the definition that you find in Marx, so you should try to read it in Smith as it appears. He says the value has two dimensions. One is value in use, and his definition is the utility of some particular object. Now the term utility should raise a red flag because we use the term utility today to mean something, which is not the way it used to mean. If you pick up a book from the 18th or 19th century that was not written by an economist, you would find the word utility meaning something else. It means usefulness. Smith, in fact, talks about it as the usefulness of some object, value in use. So what is the difference between the idea of usefulness and the modern idea of utility? What do we mean by utility now? If you pick up your standard micro textbook. Satisfaction, but not just satisfaction.
The one is a very, like, that's a very subjective category, like it's individualized, and for the classics it's something that is actually like objectively there, like the pen is useful to write with it.
Exactly right. That's a very important point. In the classical sense, usefulness is an objective property. Water is very useful. Whether or not we can quantify that, it's a statement with great meaning, right? And Smith says diamonds have very little use. And that's before the industrial use of diamonds. So they were used for decoration, basically. And only for few people. So we could say they are of limited use. And that's a meaningful statement. In modern economics, we talk about utility as something that's purely subjective and is purely psychological. And so therefore it's quite different in character. Yes?
It's that this value in use is also like socially determined, right?
Yes. Value in use, yes, it's a very important point. I was going to come to that. Value in use implies a social determination, whereas utility, it makes it seem as if it just comes from your head. You know, you're born as a child. I don't know when your utility function exactly pops out, but then at some point you have a utility function, the first time you're allowed to spend money, I suppose, and then you have a utility function. It's not socially constructed, because if you allow social construction into this story, then you could argue that it can be changed. And then the market is not just serving your social need, your individual personal needs, it's becoming socially constructed. So utility is constructed in the most bizarre fashion in modern economics. It's individual, it's subjective, it cannot be compared. You cannot say that an extra dollar is worth less to Bill Gates than it is to a starving person, because that comparison is ruled out by the idea that it's interpersonal, that's subjective, and we're not allowed to make interpersonal comparisons. And you're not allowed to say it's socially constructed either, because then you can change it. There are all kinds of restrictions. And worst of all, what does your utility depend on? What's in that function? No, that's how you get to the height of pleasure of utility. But what goes into the function? No, that gives you the shape of the function. What's the argument mathematically of the function? Goods. X1, X2, X3. What is X1, X2, X3? There's not people. It's not saying if I get more X1, my mother gets less. No, a utility function takes into account. That's excluded from a utility function. In a utility function, each individual is a bizarre entity, isolated and indifferent to society. Gary Becker is an example of a person who extends this argument to the family, but the husband takes into account what the rest of his family wants. Not the family. So the children are the object, X1 and X2, and then there's XC, which is the children, and XW, which is the wife, but they're not allowed to come back and say, wait a minute, that's not what I want. The husband's supposed to know. And that's because it's just a trick to get around this difficulty of the construction of a vision of society in which society is abstracted from the start. The point is that you won't find that starting point in the classical tradition at all. Smith is already going to begin with classes. He's going to begin with a philosopher and a street porter who are not so different in ability, but their difference comes from the social construction of their place in society. And this is typical of the classical tradition, and it is impossible at the ground floor in the neoclassical tradition. Yes?
In the past few years, have you noticed a change in modern economics with respect to...
Sure. This leads me into my digression, but I don't want to spend too much time on it. But needless to say, since in the last 10 or 15 years, but certainly since the crisis, neoclassical theory is under a lot of criticism. And people have been trying to introduce social determination into utility functions. At least one Nobel laureate has gotten, since Gary Becker, has gotten recognition for that. I would argue that that cannot be made into a general construction, simply because you immediately run into the difficulty that if you depend, it's possible to say, I can sneak into the preference structure is socially determined. But what I prefer is also socially determined. And if I prefer the other people get something less or more, then you run into problems. Technically speaking, you have the difficulty that if all the utility functions depend on each other, you can't get the lovely results which say the kinds of things that economists need to say if they are of the neoclassical persuasion. Okay? But many other economic traditions do not begin from that, or they avoid that in some way by introducing these other factors later. So I only got as far as value in use, so let me get to value in exchange, because the other side of the argument in Adam Smith is the other aspect of value is value in exchange. You could call it use value versus exchangeable value. Or you could call it usefulness versus relative price. These are adequate representations of the difference. Everybody understand that? So he's concerned now with what determines why I get so many pieces of paper for one pencil. What's the determination of value in exchange of this pencil? Why do I get for this one pencil so many pieces of paper and this much water in a bottle and so on? And what's the rule of value in exchange? The definition of value in exchange is the power of purchasing other goods. Well, with this pencil, I can exchange it for so many pieces of paper. I can purchase the paper, in effect. Perhaps the mediation of money, but I can get the paper. Same thing, I can get water, and I can get a book, and so on. So he's concerned with what determines that power, or what determines the relative price. And he argues, and we're going to elaborate this argument in a little while, that the nominal price of a good is its money price. But the real price, he says, is the labor required to obtain it. Now, there are different interpretations of that. He's going to argue that this is what it goes behind, what determines the relative price. Not determines in the sense of that's the only factor, but determines in the sense that it's the dominant factor. And I'm going to postpone the details of this argument till we come to Ricardo, because Ricardo picks it up and provides the details. But I want you to be clear that he's speaking about labor required to construct something as being its real price. And one way to think of that is its real social cost, which is how he puts it, but not necessarily how Ricardo will put it. So here, labor appears in a different role here, which is in determining value of exchange, value in exchange, which is different from the first role, which is creation of the wealth. In creation of wealth, labor participates in the creation of new goods and services. In exchange, the amount of labor in one thing relative to the amount of labor in the other thing have a major influence in determining the exchange ratio between the first and the second. Everybody understand that? Not the only determinant. Smith is going to establish that already, but Ricardo is going to provide much more detail about that, but a fundamental determinant. I am going to later on in the course show you how this argument works empirically in the United States today, because as I said, it's not about the history of dead thought, but in my opinion, the history of better thought. So we're going to look at it empirically. Now, Smith comes to a very crucial stage in this argument about labor determining the exchange value, the relative prices of commodities. And he does so by separating out analytically production, exchange, and competition, which is one set, from profit and capital, which is another set. Because he wants to make the point that you can talk about exchange without profit, and that the law of exchange can be established in the absence of profit, and then we ask, how does the presence of profit modify the law? That's a proper analytical procedure. It's like talking about gravity first, and then talking about friction, because this friction is a second order feature in most phenomena when you're talking about gravity. Okay? So it's a reasonable procedure. The one thing that Smith does is he then begins with an example in which there is no accumulation of stock or appropriation of land, because he wants to leave aside for the moment capital and labor. So in his mind, that's equivalent to no accumulation of stock and no private property in land. But he has competition. And he calls this the rude and early state of society. There's no rude and early state of society in which people produce for themselves and compete in markets without any private property in land or accumulation of means of production. But think of that. Leave aside his mythic anthropology of this being some early state of society and look at the logic of it. The logic is that you have a situation in which you have exchange, you have labor, you have tools, and he wants to know what happens when people can freely produce and own what they produce and exchange what they produce. What determines the relative price? And if you looked at it analytically, this rude and early state can be thought of as the first part of an argument about exchange within a capitalist society. This is generalized exchange without yet having profit or capital. Is that point clear? Okay. So he says, in that situation, the amount of the exchange of a commodity will be determined solely by the quantity of labor required for it. Now, I will elaborate on this when we come to Ricardo, because Ricardo will elaborate on it, and I will give you numerical examples. But here's something you can show generally. Imagine that we have two sets of producers. This side of the room are deer hunters, and this side of the room are beaver hunters. Each one of them makes their own tools or gets tools from a third set of people who make beaver traps and bows and arrows. So the price of a commodity will depend on how much you have to pay for your tools, plus how much labor time you put into, I'm sorry, let me not say that right. The total labor time in a commodity will depend on the labor time required to produce the beaver trap and the labor time required to catch a beaver. Direct and indirectly per beaver, that's your labor time. For deer hunters, there's a labor time required to produce bows and arrows and the labor time required to use the bows and arrows to catch a deer. You average the number of deers, average the number of beavers, and you get an average labor time. Everybody got me there? Now, Smith's point is the following. If these two sets of hunters charge different prices, let's say they get away with different prices, so that here the price is high enough so the income of beaver trappers is 10 pounds in a week, and the income of deer trappers is only 8 pounds in a week. They're both spending 8 hours of labor time, and we can always partition it out so that the total amount of labor time is the same. So in that situation, they have different amounts of income from the same hours of living labor. The same thing for the producers of the raw materials, of the tools. They also sell their tools and they get a certain income. His point is that if the incomes are different, notice I'm not saying wages, because these are not workers, they're producers, but they own their own product, so they are self-employed, they are free labor. If the wages are higher, if the income is higher here rather than there, then some people who make deer are going to quit that and join beaver production. They can make more money that way. Same thing for one of the sets of tools. If those are different, they'll move from one type of production to another. Therefore, you will end up with, according to Smith's mythic anthropology, competition will produce a division of labor in which equal quantities of labor, directly and indirectly, directly first, but because indirectly is also part of somebody's direct labor, in which equal quantities of labor will earn equal incomes. Now, if that is the case, one can show formally that the relative prices of any set of goods will be proportional to the direct and indirect labor time for them. And you can sort of intuitively see why. If every labor time earns the same income, then the price is the sum of the labor times, the price of the sum of the incomes, which is proportional to labor time. So the price of this to the price of that will be in proportion to the labor times. Okay, and we'll show this. I'll show this formally. It's fairly straightforward, but it was already intuitively clear to Smith that this is a result that will follow as long as there's competition, so that people can go from low income activities to high income activities, thereby bringing the price down here and bringing the income down here, bringing the price up at the other side and bringing the income up until the income is the same. Well, if every hour of labor gets the same income, then through a given price, then the prices have to be proportional to the amount of labor. You see that? Okay, so this is very central, because in this rude and early state, the law of exchange is that commodities exchange in proportion to their direct and indirect labor time. Is it not because they should, not because it is just, but because it is the result of the invisible hand of competition. This is the classical simple labor theory of value, meaning of exchange value. But notice that it is not because he says that they should get it. It's a result that competition enforces. It's a result of the invisible hand. Then Smith comes to a very critical point, which is that he says, now let's consider that we bring capitalist production into the story. And let's suppose that stock has accumulated, or land later on. He says, well, then the capitalists could cut themselves in for a portion of the income that was previously going entirely to the producers. Because they could say, and he says they have a right, you've been using my machines, he switches over, now you're employed by me, which is a crucial difference. The social relations have been changed. But analytically, the capitalist says, well, I have a right to a share of your income. Well, evidently, if every capitalist took a same percentage of the income, then nothing would be changed. The same amount of money would be generated by each production sector. But now it would be divided, let's say 50-50 among the producers, who are now workers, and the owners, who get the other 50%. And you can see that the relative price won't be changed. There's no need for it to change, because you've done a division, which is simply of the same existing, under the same existing conditions. Why is this important? Because in this one step, Smith has introduced class and capitalism without having disturbed the principle of relative price. So he's established the principle that the existence of profit and the existence of private property and means of production, and later he goes on to land, Same principle. The landlords can say, well, what about me? I need my 10% from every piece of income. As long as the demand made by the owners of the land and means of production are proportional to the value added, the total value added is not changed. It's just divided in different proportions, which means that in fact the relative prices don't have to change. And so he establishes there is nothing in the existence of capitalism per se which requires a change in the relative prices or deviation of relative prices from relative labor times. Okay? And Smith doesn't get further than that, except to say that that principle that every capitalist will ask for just a fraction of the value added, the same percentage in other words, is obviously not true, because capitalists will say that competition among capitalists will enforce that they get an equal profit rate on the value of their capital, not on the amount of labor expended in production. So that, he says, will cause a disturbance, a deviation of prices from this rule of prices proportional to labor time. And the same thing for the landlord. The landlord is not going to ask for equal rents from equal amounts of labor, but equal rents from equal values of land. Competition will enforce that the same land will get the same rent, but then to go to the landlord. Therefore, he says, under these more general conditions, the landlord will get income relative to the value of the land owned by the landlord. The capitalist will get income relative in proportion to the value of capital, which is now privately owned means of production used to make profit. And workers will get equal wages in proportion to the labor. But that produces a different principle of price, of relative price. And Smith does not elaborate on it. He invents the principle, I mean, he establishes it, but he doesn't elaborate analytically on it. And this point becomes critical in Ricardo. And it's been critical from then on, debate about whether the labor theory value holds when you more generally, or how much it holds, and so on. Just to tell you, Ricardo is going to pick up from this point and say it's going to modify the relative determination, but not by much. So that Smith's original idea that prices are largely determined by labor time will still shown to be true. And we can ask if that's analytically possible, we can ask if that's mathematically possible, and we can ask if that's empirically possible. And in this course, we will do all three. You might want to brush up on your linear algebra in the meantime, because it'll come in handy at some point. Okay, so let me stop there and take a little break. And we're going to come back. I'm going to ask you if you have any questions about this part with the two really interesting issues of growth and the end of capitalism, which come up this way.